There's a couple announcements they've asked me to have. Barry, are you here? Great. So Barry's going to come up and talk a little bit. And please remain in your seats for the Secretary's keynote. Let me get out of the way.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Barry Pavao. I'm a Senior Vice President at the Atlantic Council and Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and that's where we house our Cyber Statecraft Initiative and this fantastic conference. Thank you to those of you who are here for persisting. It will be worth it. I hope everyone has enjoyed and gained insights from the really excellent conversations today. I thought that last panel was particularly interesting. I have the honor this evening of introducing our last, but certainly not least, keynote address. Keynote speaker. We started the day with the FBI, and we're going to end it with the Department of Homeland Security. Michael Chertoff was the second Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security and assumed that position at a particularly critical time. He was the Secretary from 2005 to 2009, and in 2005, if we went back to that time period, I think it's safe to say that the United States Homeland Security apparatus was still maturing, was still settling out, and looking at what was accomplished under Secretary Chertoff's leadership, it's clear he had a lot to do with maturing the department during the second term of the Bush administration and really exercised skillful and in some ways historic leadership to put the Department of Homeland Security on a solid footing, and this includes a lot of cyber progress as well. Earlier in his career, he served as a federal judge and also as head of the Department of Justice's Criminal Division. Secretary Chertoff also is the author of the recently published book, Exploding Data: Reclaiming Our Cybersecurity in the Digital Age. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Michael Chertoff.
Thank you, Barry. I'm acutely aware of the fact that I am in the middle of what is generally described as cocktail hour, and therefore I'm standing between you and hopefully a very pleasant evening. But I thought I'd take the opportunity maybe to just kind of stand back. You've had a whole day of very detailed discussion about aspects of what is going on internationally in the world of cyber, but really to step back and look at the whole picture. As Barry said, when I first got involved in the issue of cyber policy, it was as a matter of cybersecurity. And cybersecurity, very narrowly defined, is really about preserving the integrity and the availability of our systems, both those that operate and those that transmit and hold our data at rest. That is still very much the core of classic cybersecurity. But I think now the landscape of cyberspace has broadened quite a bit. First of all, increasingly, because of the availability of the internet and because of other technological advances, there are enormous quantities of data that are being generated, being collected, stored, analyzed, and used in a variety of different settings. And how that data is controlled and the use that's made out of it becomes an issue that, while related to cybersecurity, is distinct, because it's not just about whether you can protect the data against theft or disruption, but it's about whether you commit yourself to using the data in certain ways and forbear using it in other ways. So we need to look at the content of the data as well as the manner of transmission and how we secure it. At the other extreme, there is the actual infrastructure of the internet. I'm always amused when people talk about the cloud because it kind of conjures up the idea that the data is being held somewhere in the sky. But as we all know, the storage and movement of the data takes place in real life, in real time, although very fast real time. And protecting and preserving the infrastructure that allows that to happen is critical. In fact, one of the things I want to talk a little bit about is the fact that we're poised for the next big revolution in infrastructure. And I know you heard about that in a panel earlier. And that has to do with moving from 4G to 5G. But again, how the rules of controlling that infrastructure are defined and who actually winds up occupying the commanding position in that infrastructure is going to determine a great deal about who controls the commanding heights for the next 20 to 30 to 40 years of our global economy. So this issue, although it seems technical, also engages very serious policy and geopolitical considerations. So as I kind of stand back and look at these, let me just talk briefly about each of these elements. First of all, the issue of data. The reality is, to a far greater degree than most people understand, we generate an enormous amount of what I call digital exhaust. Everybody understands if you get on Facebook or if you perform a search and you sign on to allow cookies, that you are generating data about yourself. But most people don't realize how much data they're unthinkingly generating. So for example, I'm wearing my Apple Watch. That generates things about my running times and my heartbeat and things of that sort. And that gets uploaded to an app. And I make a decision that I'm willing to accept sharing that data because the value to me of having the data collected is, pretty significant. But if I think about it, I have to consider all the other ways I share data. The location of my phone is data that's constantly being shared. If I go to the supermarket and I use a loyalty card to get a discount on the food I buy, the supermarket now knows the food I buy. If I wind up using my credit card, there's data about where and when and what I bought. And all of this data can be pulled together because often it does reside in the cloud, or because there's now a robust business in selling and buying data. Many people describe data as the new oil or the new gold. But even apart from things that I do perhaps unwittingly, are the things you all do with respect to my data. So if any of you are going to tweet about what I'm saying, that's going to indicate to somebody who has access to Twitter that I was here at this time. And if you have locational data on your phone, exactly where here is. If you wind up recording some of this or taking a photograph with me afterwards, that is going to be more data that gets uploaded. So that in many ways, unlike George Orwell's 1984, the surveillance that we are beginning to see growing and growing in our daily lives is not being run by the government, it's being run by each other. It's as if there is not really a big brother, but we're all a lot of little brothers and sisters surveilling ourselves and surveilling each other. So what are the implications of this? Well, much of our personal security and our freedom depends upon how this data is used. And we typically talk about privacy in the sense that we're trying to keep information hidden or secret. And for the reasons I've stated, that becomes a very, very challenging thing to do in this day and age. But what's more important than keeping it secret, and that ship has sailed, is what happens with the data and how is it used. Is it used as a way of manipulating you, coercing you, or incentivizing you to behave in a certain way literally every hour of the day? When I wrote the book that Barry mentioned, I was positing a world in which insurance companies insisted on collecting, or that you turn over your data, measuring your exercise and what you eat and other things like that, as well as your heart rate and your vital signs, and they would adjust your premium depending on whether they thought you were having a healthy lifestyle or not. Within a matter of a few months after the book came out, insurance companies were doing that. And employers were doing it too, insisting they wanted to see how healthy their employees are. And then, remarkably, in the last 2 weeks, there was a story in the newspaper about a new app called Ovia. Ovia can be offered by employers to female employees who are interested in conceiving a child or maybe pregnant. And what it does is it allows the collection of data about temperature, other characteristics of your vital signs, what you're eating, how much activity you're getting. All of this supposedly in the service of assisting people to have a healthy pregnancy and a healthy child. This is, however, shared with the employer, albeit anonymously. And I have to say, I really wonder how comfortable I would feel if I were a woman who was thinking of having a child or pregnant in having this kind of data out there, even if I was told no one was going to associate it with my name. So that shows you how far we've come, even in the years since I've written the book. And therefore, I think one of the big challenges we have is to begin to talk about a way of managing data globally. The Europeans have created the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. We're following somewhat similar paths in California and Vermont. But more and more the issue of what is the standard of giving people control and notice about their data is going to become, I think, a global issue that we all have to deal with. At the end of the day, there are some fundamental disagreements. I think we can probably agree with many Western liberal democracies on a roughly similar set of rules about how data ought to be controlled. But again, as reported pretty widely in China, there's now a social credit score where the use of the data, coupled with facial recognition and who your friends are and all the elements of your life, can be used to characterize whether you are a good citizen or not a good citizen. And that is, at least for people, I think, in the United States and in the West, a fairly chilling thought. So this is going to be one of the big challenges that we face with cyber engagement, is how do we come up with a set of rules on notice and control of data that at least appeal to a significant part of the world, even if there'll be some parts that don't sign on. And that brings us to the second challenge. How do we deal with the law and the policy and the rules in a world where law is still a matter of individual sovereign nations, but the data is global and moves all over the world? And we see this tension increasingly with the issue of sovereignty coming into conflict with the idea of a seamless, globally available internet. In some cases, for example, and this applies to the United States as well as other countries, when a court in one country authorizes a prosecutor or an official to get data about a citizen, the data is not in that country. The data may be in another country. And although some people argue, well, it's like a bank, the bank's always required to turn over its own data when it does business somewhere. When we deal with data that's being stored, for example, in a database or a server in another part of the world, some people argue it's more like a safety deposit box. A judge in one country can't require a bank sitting in another to open up a safety deposit box. You have to go to the courts of that country. More challenging yet are the rules where we have different standards about what is permitted to be transmitted and accessed over the internet. In this country, we believe in free speech. That's true in Europe as well, but in Europe they've developed a right to be forgotten, which is the idea that when somebody has a story that they feel is unfavorable, even if it's true, they have a right to go to the authorities in a country in Europe and say, this ought to be removed from a search engine. And the European Court has upheld that rule, so that if you're in Germany and there's a story about you that you don't want to have available on a search engine, you can petition to have it removed, and someone in Germany seeking to run you through a search is not going to find the story. Now, right now, as we speak, they are litigating and considering an effort on the part of some European plaintiffs to make that a global requirement. So if you're a German and you want it off the search engine, if the court rules in favor of this approach, they would require Google or Yahoo or another company, on pain of being punished, to remove it from a search engine all over the world, including for an American accessing from Washington. And I know we say to ourselves, well, wait a second. We have freedom of speech. The idea that a government, let alone a foreign government, is going to order us to take data off and not allow truthful speech is a little bit troubling, to say the least. But again, the issue of how we reconcile sovereignty and the fundamental values that underline our sovereignty with the global nature of data is going to be a critical issue for how the cyber economy works in the future. If we don't get it right, we are going to wind up with multiple internets that are national or local in configuration, and much of the economic value will have been dissipated. Yet another issue, as I mentioned earlier, is the actual fundamental infrastructure and core of the internet. And that involves at least a couple of things. One is the physical infrastructure that it makes the internet available and preserves its integrity, whether it's cables, servers, wireless equipment, things of that sort. The second are the protocols that allow the system to operate, and that is largely contained in the domain name system, which is essentially the directory or the telephone book for the internet that allows us to use the protocols to transmit from one place to another. Both of these are essential if the internet as a whole is to function. And in a world in which we have criminality, but frankly also state-sponsored harmful activity on the internet, the question is, what are the rules of the road that have to apply that would apply similar to the way the Geneva Convention applies when we're dealing with physical warfare? Now, right now, I'm the co-chair of something called the Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace, which is a multi-stakeholder group sponsored by both the private sector and a number of governments that is trying to look at what are kind of core principles and norms for the basic functioning of the internet that private and public bodies ought to sign on to and honor in much the same way that we honor rules about free use of the oceans and the seas. And the first and most fundamental norm that we have proposed is the protection of the public core of the internet. Literally the physical structures, the cables and servers, and the DNS system that allow the internet to function for everybody. The idea here is, much as in the physical world, we don't bomb civilian power plants when we're involved in conflict because it violates the laws of armed conflict, we ought to have a similar set of norms and ultimately rules for cyber conflict. This is not merely a theoretical issue. Many of you will have read stories recently about a previously undisclosed hacker group that has been carrying out a series of attacks on government agencies in 13 countries by corrupting and hijacking the DNS system so that when people think they are pinging a website, it's actually being misdirected to a website that's controlled by these hacker groups. This is exactly the kind of conduct that we all need to band together to suppress and to defend against. And as we talk about the need to protect the public core in terms of criminality, we also should consider the next generation of technology that is going to support the internet, and that is 5G. This is going to be important not only because the security of the internet is no better than the security of the actual hardware and software that allows it to operate, but also because the ability to compete globally is going to depend upon having free and fair access to this infrastructure. Imagine a world in which international trade could not take place without paying a particular toll because one country controlled all the sea lanes and you couldn't transport items from one part of the globe to the other without getting permission. Well, that is potentially an issue we need to consider about with 5G. Will there be a dominance by one country or the champions of one country in terms of controlling 5G, Or will we have healthy competition? And will we have an agreement among multiple countries on the standards that ought to be in place so there is nobody who actually sets the standard for everybody else? Just last week, the EU Commissioner for Justice called for a policy on emerging IT technologies, particularly 5G, coordinated with the United States, Japan, and Europe at a minimum. And in much the same way, we need to have a similar set of agreements on how data is used and protected, again, among, at a minimum, these three countries, or these three regions of the world, which do support a good deal, if not obviously all, the economic and social activity over the internet. I echo this concern, and one of the things I have been working on with representatives from Japan and Europe is a trilateral cybersecurity commission that is particularly looking at how freedom-loving countries, so-called liberal democracies, can cooperate together on having policy recommendations with data, with security, and with infrastructure that can be sufficiently interoperable that we can actually have, if not a perfectly global internet, a largely reciprocal internet over much of the globe. The time has come for government and industry leaders, and much of the innovation work is done at the industry level, to come together and form a common bond about how we are going to roll out the new technologies and deal with the new data challenges in the 21st century. As we've seen rather dramatically in many countries in the world, if you don't pay attention, problems tend to sneak up on you. And Exhibit A are the experiences a number of countries have had with respect to election meddling over the last several years, meddling that involves not just hacking and interfering with the electoral process in terms of infrastructure, but the manipulation of social media and data analytics in order to allow disruption and destruction of some of the social cohesiveness which underlies our democracies. So it's terrific to have people here looking to increase cyber engagement, looking to increase that engagement on an international level. There'll be some profound differences between some parts of the world and others. I think we can agree on some things, maybe universally. Others we may wind up going in somewhat divergent ways. But the important thing is to be aware of the issue, to understand its full dimensions and its interconnections, and to talk about it and put our private and our public bodies to work thinking about how we can manage the internet for the benefit of all of our citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary Chertoff. Thank you all for sticking with us for another year. It's always my favorite time because I remember all the faces that are here at the end, and then I know you are my true friends and colleagues in this fight. So I want to thank you. I want to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting the conference this year. It's been a lot of fun, and I've learned a lot actually just working with the Atlantic Council team. It would never have been possible without all the events people and the staff. You wouldn't believe how many people it takes. It's only taking more and more every year. So I also want to thank sponsors. They never get enough of praise, and they don't really get much out of this in terms of selling things, but they become partners, which is really important for me and I think for the conference. So I also want to thank you guys for coming and thank all the speakers for all the work they did. And I want to invite you guys to give me, feedback. Let me know. I always am looking for more and more partners. In developing this, it takes a year, and I don't ever assume that I know what the best content is, so I spend all my time asking people. So I would like people to just start voluntarily telling me or suggesting things, because it's never one person or one organization or even one country that actually is going to be able to figure these things out. It's really a large community. So thank you very much. Have a great evening, rest of your night, and the rest of your week. Thank you, guys.